Decapitated by tree branch. On May 14, 2022, a routine bus journey through suburban Cleveland became the scene of one of the most shocking transportation accidents ever recorded. Jerome Hartman, a 78-year-old retired postal worker, was returning from visiting his daughter when the unthinkable happened. The day was unseasonably warm, and the air conditioning on the city bus was struggling to keep up. Feeling uncomfortable in the heat, Hartman leaned slightly toward his partially opened window. It was a simple action, something thousands of commuters do every day without consequence. The bus was traveling at approximately 35 miles per hour down Lakeside Avenue, a tree-lined street where branches sometimes grew close to the roadway. What happened next occurred in less than a second. A thick, low-hanging oak branch, one that had been marked for trimming by city workers but never addressed, aligned perfectly with Hartman's window. As he leaned out just inches from the glass, the branch caught his neck with catastrophic precision. The impact was instantaneous and fatal. Medical examiners later described it as a clean transection of the cervical spine, a clinical term for what passengers experienced as horror. The force was so severe that Hartman's head was completely separated from his body. Other passengers only realized what had happened when they saw blood spray across the side of the bus, and Hartman's headless body slumped into the aisle. The bus driver immediately stopped, but there was nothing anyone could do. Jerome Hartman had died instantly, his life ended by the kind of freak accident most people dismiss as urban legend. First responders described it as one of the most disturbing scenes they had ever encountered. What should have been impossible had become tragically real. Wrong direction. On March 22, 2024, the entertainment industry lost one of its versatile talents in a crash that should never have happened. The 46-year-old actor, known for his recurring roles in Grey's Anatomy and his memorable appearance in The Artist, had just left a private screening in Burbank, California. It was just after midnight when Young got into his Tesla Model 3 and headed east on the 134 freeway. Those who saw him at the screening later reported he was in good spirits, discussing upcoming photography projects. As an accomplished celebrity photographer with over 2 million Instagram followers, Young had captured portraits of stars like David Harbour and Seth Green. What Young couldn't have known was that at that same moment, a 29-year-old woman named Melissa Trent had entered the westbound lanes of the freeway traveling east. She was severely intoxicated, with a blood alcohol level later measured at 0.24, 3 times the legal limit. At 12:37 a.m., Young's Tesla rounded a bend at 65 miles per hour. The headlights of Trent's Jeep Cherokee appeared suddenly in his lane. There was no time to react. The vehicles collided head-on with the combined force of over 120 miles per hour. The impact was devastating. Young's vehicle crumpled, the airbags deployed, but the forces involved were too extreme. The steering column was pushed back into his chest, causing immediate traumatic cardiac arrest. First responders found him unresponsive at the scene. Despite immediate CPR attempts, Brad Everett Young was pronounced dead at 1:05 a.m. Trent survived with multiple fractures and internal injuries, protected by her larger vehicle. Deadly speed and recklessness. On May 31, 2024, what should have been a routine journey on the A1 in County Durham, UK, turned into an unimaginable tragedy. Carlene Warner, a 30-year-old air hostess, was traveling with her sister, Shalorna, and Shalorna's 8-month-old son, Zachary, in a Volkswagen Polo. The family was returning from a shopping trip when their paths crossed with Daryl Anderson, a 38-year-old construction worker. Anderson was driving home after a holiday in Turkey, where he had been drinking heavily at the airport and continued consuming alcohol on the flight. Tests would later show he had 95 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of breath, nearly triple the legal limit. Just moments before the collision, Anderson took a photo of his BMW's speedometer showing 141 miles per hour and sent it to friends with the caption, "Flying now." Witnesses reported his car weaving dangerously through traffic before approaching the Warner's vehicle. Anderson made no attempt to brake. The BMW slammed into the smaller car with such catastrophic force that the Polo was torn apart. The impact was so violent that infant Zachary was ejected through the window and thrown 45 meters onto the opposite carriageway. Carlene died instantly from massive internal trauma. Her torso had been crushed by the engine block as it was forced into the passenger compartment. Zachary's tiny body suffered multiple fractures and a traumatic brain injury that proved immediately fatal. When questioned by police, Anderson showed little remorse, telling officers, "Mistakes happen, don't they?" He was later found with cocaine in his system in addition to the alcohol. Shalorna survived with life-changing injuries, forced to live with the knowledge that half her family was gone in an instant. Overtaking motorcycle gone wrong. On Wednesday, August 17, 2023, the narrow roads of Pothencote and Thiruvananthapuram became the setting for a split-second decision with fatal consequences. Rahim, a 45-year-old electronic shop owner, was riding his motorcycle with his wife Fatima seated behind him. It was approximately 2:30 p.m. when the couple approached Chathampadu Junction on the Pothencote-Kanyakulangara road. The midday traffic was moderate, moving at a steady pace under the hot Kerala sun. Ahead of them was a large delivery truck traveling at around 30 kilometers per hour. Growing impatient with the slow-moving vehicle, Rahim decided to overtake. He accelerated his Royal Enfield motorcycle, moving into the opposing lane. What he couldn't see was an oncoming car just beyond the curve. Witnesses later reported that Rahim swerved sharply to avoid a head-on collision. In that critical moment, his motorcycle lost balance. Both Rahim and Fatima were thrown from the bike. While Fatima landed on the side of the road, Rahim fell directly in the path of the truck he had been trying to pass. The truck driver slammed on his brakes, but it was too late. The massive front wheel rolled over Rahim's chest and head. The pressure was immense, crushing his ribcage and skull instantly. Medical experts later confirmed that death would have been immediate, with catastrophic damage to all vital organs. Fatima watched in horror as her husband was crushed before her eyes. She suffered a fractured pelvis and severe trauma, but remained conscious throughout the ordeal. First responders found her cradling what remained of her husband's body, screaming for help that could no longer make a difference. The truck driver, a 32-year-old man named Suresh, remained at the scene in a state of shock. German tourist couple in NYC. On September 24, 2025, the streets of Midtown Manhattan were crowded with tourists and locals enjoying a clear autumn day. Among them were a German couple from Hamburg, a 50-year-old woman and her 55-year-old husband, taking photographs near the corner of 5th Avenue and East 41st Street. At approximately 2:15 p.m., a green Toyota Sienna minivan, driven by a 40-year-old man, approached the intersection. The driver, later identified as Marcus Reeves, had been operating the vehicle without a valid license. Witnesses reported that the minivan suddenly accelerated in reverse at high speed. The German couple had no time to react. In seconds, they were pinned between the reversing Sienna and a stationary box truck that had been making deliveries. The impact was catastrophic. The woman took the brunt of the collision as the metal edges of both vehicles created a shearing force at neck level. First responders arrived within minutes to find a scene of horror. The woman's head was nearly severed, connected only by a few strands of tissue and vertebrae. Blood pooled across the sidewalk as bystanders stood frozen in shock. Medical examiners later confirmed that her carotid arteries and jugular vein were completely transected, causing immediate massive blood loss. Her husband survived the initial impact but suffered a severe fracture to his skull and multiple broken ribs. As he lay semi-conscious on the pavement, he reached toward his wife, unaware that she was already beyond help. Meanwhile, Reeves abandoned the damaged minivan 2 blocks away and fled on foot. Security camera footage showed him calmly walking into a coffee shop as if nothing had happened. Police apprehended him approximately 1 hour later. When questioned, Reeves displayed no remorse. "I did not hit anybody," he insisted, despite the blood still visible on the front of his clothes. The man's denial stood in stark contrast to the evidence and the life that had been violently cut short, dragged to death by car. On January 1st, 2023, as New Delhi welcomed the new year with celebrations, a 20-year-old event management trainee became the victim of one of India's most horrifying road incidents. Anjali Singh had attended a New Year's party and was returning home on her scooter at approximately 2 a.m. when disaster struck. The roads were mostly empty as Singh navigated through the Kanjawala area of outer Delhi. A Maruti Baleno car with 5 men returning from their own celebrations approached from behind. The driver, Deepak Khanna, had a blood alcohol level later measured at twice the legal limit. The car struck Singh's scooter from behind, throwing her onto the hood. Rather than stopping, Khanna accelerated. Singh's clothing became entangled in the undercarriage of the vehicle. Her right leg was caught in the car's axle, trapping her. What followed was 12 kilometers of unimaginable horror. Singh was dragged beneath the moving vehicle while still alive. CCTV footage showed the car continuing at speeds of 40 to 60 kilometers per hour, with Singh's body being pulled along the rough asphalt. Medical examiners later determined that she remained conscious for several minutes, experiencing extreme pain as her skin was torn away layer by layer. The men in the car later claimed they didn't realize someone was trapped beneath their vehicle, despite witnesses reporting they had stopped briefly, checked underneath, then continued driving. Singh's body was found at 4:10 a.m., nearly unrecognizable from the extensive abrasions. Her skull had been partially crushed, and over 40% of her skin had been scraped away by the road surface. The autopsy revealed Singh had died from a combination of blood loss, traumatic shock, and massive internal injuries. Her brain showed signs that she had been conscious during much of the ordeal, experiencing every moment of being dragged across the pavement. The Truck Sinkhole. On January 28, 2025, a massive 3-ton delivery truck was making its routine morning route through Yashio in Japan's Saitama Prefecture. The driver, 42-year-old Hiroshi Tanaka, had traveled this same road hundreds of times before. It was just after 7:30 a.m. when witnesses heard what sounded like thunder beneath the pavement. In an instant, the road collapsed. A sinkhole 30 feet wide opened beneath the truck, swallowing it almost completely. Only the rear edge of the vehicle remained visible above ground level. The truck didn't just fall. It plunged into darkness, carried downward by thousands of pounds of asphalt and soil. First responders arrived within minutes. They could see parts of the truck's cargo area, but the cab where Tanaka sat had disappeared entirely into the earth. Ground-penetrating operating radar revealed a horrifying truth. The truck had fallen into an enormous void created by a collapsed sewer system nearly 50 feet below the surface. Rescue teams attempted to reach the cab, but each effort was met with further collapse. The unstable ground shifted constantly, threatening to trap rescuers alongside the victim. After 3 days of failed attempts, officials made the grim decision to pause the recovery operation. What followed was unprecedented in modern rescue efforts. For 3 months, Tanaka remained entombed while engineers worked to stabilize the massive cavity. His family held vigil nearby as construction crews built reinforcement structures around and into the sinkhole. On May 2nd, when rescuers finally reached the crushed cab, they found Tanaka's body still strapped in the driver's seat. Autopsy reports revealed he had survived the initial fall, but died from crushing injuries as secondary collapses piled more weight onto the vehicle. The most haunting detail emerged from Tanaka's recovered phone. His final text message, never sent due to lack of signal. "Something's happening to the road. I think Boulder on a windscreen." On November 13, 2019, Margaret Christensen was driving her Subaru Forester along New Zealand's State Highway 6. The 59-year-old school administrator was accompanied by her sister-in-law in the passenger seat. It was a clear afternoon as they wound through the coastal road connecting Inangahua and Westport, famous for its stunning views and equally notorious for its geologically unstable cliffs. At 2:15 p.m., a delivery truck passed them going the opposite direction. The vibration was barely noticeable, but it was enough. High above on the steep cliff face, a boulder roughly the size of a television set that had been precariously balanced for decades finally shifted. The rock, weighing approximately 75 pounds, broke free and plummeted toward the road below. It fell nearly 60 feet, gathering deadly momentum with each passing millisecond. Margaret never saw it coming. She was navigating a gentle curve when the boulder struck the vehicle from above. The impact was catastrophic. The boulder didn't just crack the windshield, it punched through it entirely, striking Margaret directly in the face and upper torso. The force of the impact was so severe that her neck was broken instantly. Her foot reflexively pressed the brake, bringing the vehicle to a stop against the guardrail. Her sister-in-law, though covered in glass and suffering minor cuts, remained conscious. She described the sound as like a bomb going off inside the car. When first responders arrived 7 minutes later, they found a scene that veteran emergency worker Colin Henshaw called unlike anything I've witnessed in 22 years of service. The boulder had come to rest on the center console, still covered in blood and tissue. Margaret remained upright in her seat, held there by her seatbelt, but the damage to her head and upper body was catastrophic and instantly fatal. Her sister-in-law sat in shock beside her, still speaking to Margaret, unaware that she had died on impact. The Windshield Horror. On April 18, 2023, Kirsten Eileen Herman Strang was riding her electric bicycle along Cedar Avenue in Minneapolis. The 38-year-old single mother had just finished her shift as a nurse at Abbott Northwestern Hospital. It was 11:43 p.m., and she was wearing a reflective vest and helmet as she pedaled towards her apartment where a babysitter waited with her 2 young children. Marcus Thornton, 41, was driving his Hyundai Sonata after leaving a local bar where witnesses later confirmed he had consumed at least 7 alcoholic drinks. His blood alcohol level was later determined to be 0.21, nearly 3 times the legal limit. Thornton's car struck Kirsten from behind while traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour zone. The impact was violent and direct. Kirsten's body was thrown upward, striking the hood before crashing through the windshield. Instead of stopping, Thornton accelerated in panic. The horrifying reality was that Kirsten's upper body had become lodged in the shattered windshield, her torso and legs protruding outward, while her head and shoulders were trapped inside the passenger compartment. Security cameras along University Avenue captured the surreal scene, as Thornton continued driving for 8 blocks, with Kirsten's body embedded in his windshield. Pedestrians at a late-night taco stand watched in horror as the car passed through an intersection, the victim's legs still moving slightly, in what medical experts later described as post-mortem nerve responses. The coroner's report confirmed that Kirsten had not died instantly. She had suffered massive trauma to her spine and internal organs from the initial impact, but remained alive for approximately 70 seconds while lodged in the windshield. Thornton later claimed he didn't know what to do as he heard her gasping for breath inside his car. At Cedar and Franklin Avenue, Kirsten's body finally dislodged from the vehicle when Thornton swerved sharply to avoid a stopped delivery truck. Her body fell onto the street where it was discovered by a passing Uber driver who immediately called 911. The Coffin Hearse Crush. On December 17, 2018, in the small town of Jaguaro in southern Brazil, 67-year-old Marciana Silva Barcelos sat in the front passenger seat of a black hearse. Behind her, secured on a platform in the vehicle's rear compartment, was the wooden coffin containing the body of her husband, Josie Silveira Coimbra. He had died of natural causes at 76 after a 49-year marriage to Marciana. The hearse was traveling at a modest 30 miles per hour along Highway BR-116, heading toward the São João Cemetery where Josie would be laid to rest. Family members followed in cars behind them. The funeral procession had just departed from the local chapel where a service had been held. Marciana had insisted on riding in the hearse, wanting to accompany her husband on his final journey. At 10:37 a.m., as the hearse approached an intersection, a white Fiat Strada pickup failed to yield. The driver, later found to be texting, crashed into the rear of the hearse at approximately 45 miles per hour. The impact was severe enough to snap the restraints holding the coffin in place. Physics took over in a macabre sequence. The heavy wooden coffin, containing both Josie's body and a concrete liner, became a 320-pound projectile. It launched forward through the partition separating the rear compartment from the front seats. In a split second, the coffin slammed into the back of Marciana's head with devastating force. First responders arrived 4 minutes later to a scene one paramedic later described as something from a horror film. The coffin had wedged itself between the front seats, its corner having struck Marciana's skull with enough force to cause instantaneous fatal trauma. Medical examiner reports indicated that death was immediate, the base of her skull crushed by the impact. The hearse driver, who suffered only minor injuries, turned to check on his passenger only to find Marciana slumped forward, motionless, while her husband's coffin pressed against her from behind. In a cruel twist of fate, she died while accompanying the man she had lived with for nearly 5 decades. The Freeway Sign Corpse. On October 30th, 2015, Richard Pananian was rushing to work along the southbound I-5 freeway in Glendale, California. The 20-year-old had just been promoted at his job in a waterproofing company and was running late for his 7 o'clock a.m. shift. Friends later said he had called to say he was hurrying to avoid being marked tardy. In his haste, Pananian chose not to wear his seatbelt despite having received a ticket for the same offense just a week earlier. At 7:13 a.m., Pananian's Ford Fiesta was traveling at approximately 80 miles per hour in moderate traffic when he attempted to pass a slower vehicle. He swerved sharply, clipping the rear bumper of a pickup truck. The Fiesta spun out of control, hitting the center divider before flipping multiple times. What happened next defied probability. The violent rotation of the vehicle created centrifugal force that ejected Pananian through the sunroof. Witnesses described his body being hurled upward at a steep angle. In a moment that would later seem impossible, Pananian's body traveled nearly 20 feet vertically and 30 feet horizontally before coming to rest on the large overhead freeway sign for the Colorado Street exit. Morning commuters looked up in horror to see Pananian's body draped across the sign, motionless. Some initially thought it was a Halloween prank, given the date's proximity to the holiday. Emergency responders had to call for a specialized ladder truck to reach him. Traffic backed up for miles as drivers slowed to witness the grim spectacle overhead. Coroner's reports would later confirm that Pananian did not die immediately upon impact with the sign. The autopsy revealed he survived the ejection from his vehicle but suffered catastrophic internal injuries and bleeding. For approximately 2 minutes, he remained alive on the sign, 20 feet above thousands of passing motorists, before succumbing to his injuries. When firefighters finally reached Pananian's body, they had to cover it with a sheet before lowering it, as news helicopters circled overhead, capturing footage so disturbing that television stations refused to broadcast the unedited images. The first fatal car death. On August 31st, 1869, Mary Ward was participating in what should have been a pleasant scientific excursion. The 42-year-old was a respected Irish astronomer and naturalist, known for her detailed microscope illustrations and scientific publications. Unusual accomplishments for a woman in Victorian society. She was traveling with her cousins, including William Parsons, the Earl of Ross, who had designed an experimental steam-powered automobile they called the road locomotive. The vehicle was primitive by modern standards. Essentially a steam engine mounted on a heavy iron chassis with 4 wheels. It had no windshield, no suspension system, and crucially, no safety features whatsoever. The party was traveling at what witnesses described as walking pace plus some, approximately 4 miles per hour, along the rutted dirt roads near Parsonstown, Ireland. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the vehicle approached a sharp bend in the road. Mary sat perched on an elevated seat without handrails or restraints, leaning slightly outward to observe the mechanism's operation. The wheels on one side hit a deep pothole, causing the entire vehicle to lurch violently. Mary was thrown sideways from her seat. She fell directly into the path of the vehicle's enormous iron wheels, each weighing over 200 pounds. Before anyone could react or the primitive brakes could be applied, the rear wheel rolled over her neck and upper spine. The pressure was immense and instantaneous. Her cervical vertebrae were crushed completely, severing her spinal cord. Those present reported a distinct cracking sound as the wheel passed over her. Mary showed no signs of movement afterward. Her cousin's wife, who was also aboard, screamed as she witnessed the accident unfold mere feet away. A local doctor who arrived at the scene 10 minutes later confirmed that death had been instantaneous. The massive iron wheel had exerted over 700 pounds of pressure on her neck, far more than required to cause fatal damage. Mary Ward thus earned a macabre place in history as the first documented fatal automobile accident decades before cars became commonplace. Roger Williamson. On July 29, 1973, the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort became the scene of one of racing's most haunting failed rescues. 25-year-old Roger Williamson, a promising British driver in just his second Formula One race, was about to experience the sport at its most cruel. 8 laps into the race, Williamson's March 731 suffered a suspected tire failure at high speed. The car veered off the track, struck the barriers, and flipped upside down. The impact wasn't fatal. Williamson was alive, conscious, and trapped. Fuel began leaking from the overturned car. Within seconds, flames appeared, quickly spreading around the cockpit where Williamson remained pinned. He was fully aware of what was happening, calling out for help as smoke filled his lungs. Fellow driver David Purley witnessed the crash and did the unthinkable. He stopped his own race, parked his car, and sprinted across the live track to help. Purley could hear Williamson's desperate pleas from inside the burning wreckage. "For God's sake, David, get me out of here!" Purley tried frantically to push the car back onto its wheels, but the 1,300-pound vehicle was impossible to move alone. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from a marshal and fought the growing flames, but it was woefully inadequate against the inferno. The race marshals stood helplessly nearby. They had no fire-resistant clothing, no training for this situation. Rather than stop the race, officials allowed it to continue. Other drivers sped past the scene, many assuming the crashed driver had already escaped. Inside the cockpit, Williamson fought for every breath. The temperature rose rapidly. The smoke grew thicker. He remained conscious as the flames drew closer, hearing Purley's desperate efforts just feet away. The fire truck arrived 8 minutes after the crash. By then, Williamson had died from asphyxiation, trapped in his seat while his would-be rescuer fought alone to save him. The 1955 Le Mans disaster. On June 11, 1955, the prestigious 24 Hours of Le Mans race in France became the site of motorsport's deadliest tragedy. What made this disaster uniquely horrific wasn't just the initial crash, but how rescue attempts transformed a catastrophe into something far worse. The afternoon was warm as Pierre Levy piloted his Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR at speeds approaching 150 miles per hour. Ahead of him, a slower Austin Healey swerved unexpectedly. The Mercedes clipped the Healey from behind, launching Levy's car airborne toward the packed grandstand. The Mercedes hit a concrete barrier and disintegrated. Debris scythed through spectators like shrapnel. The car's hood decapitated multiple victims in an instant. Levy was thrown from the wreckage and killed on impact. But for many in the crowd, the horror was just beginning. The Mercedes featured a lightweight magnesium alloy body, a material that burns at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fuel tank ruptured, igniting the magnesium. A fierce white-hot fire erupted across the impact zone where dozens of injured spectators lay trapped. Emergency crews rushed forward with fire hoses, unaware they were about to make everything worse. When water hit the burning magnesium, it triggered a violent chemical reaction. Instead of extinguishing the flames, the water intensified them, creating explosions that spread the fire further among the wounded. Rescuers could hear screams from within the inferno, but couldn't approach. The magnesium burned with such intensity that it consumed human flesh completely. Some victims who had survived the initial impact now burned alive as rescuers watched helplessly, unable to reach them through the chemical fire. Most shocking of all, race officials made the decision to continue the event. As emergency workers collected remains, race cars continued speeding past at full throttle. The reasoning was coldly practical. Stopping would block access for ambulances. 83 spectators died that day, with many perishing not from the impact, but from the failed rescue that followed. Princess Diana's Paris tunnel crash. On August 31, 1997, the world was forever changed when a black Mercedes S280 carrying Princess Diana crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. What few people realize is that Diana didn't die on impact. She was killed by a series of critical failures during what should have been a straightforward rescue. Just after midnight, Diana's car was speeding through the tunnel at approximately 65 miles per hour, driven by Henry Paul, who was attempting to evade pursuing paparazzi. The Mercedes lost control, clipping a white Fiat Uno before slamming into a concrete pillar. The impact was devastating. The crash killed Henry Paul and Diana's companion Dodi Fayed instantly, but Diana was still alive in the back seat, critically injured but conscious. First responders found her slumped on the floor with her head resting against the seat in front of her. When a firefighter reached her, she opened her eyes and asked, "My God, what's happened?" What followed was a catastrophic series of rescue mistakes. French emergency protocols demanded stabilization before transport. Diana remained trapped in the wreckage for nearly an hour while paramedics attempted to stabilize her at the scene, precious minutes ticking away. After extraction, instead of rushing her to the nearest hospital, the ambulance moved at an inexplicably slow pace, about 25 miles per hour through empty Paris streets. The ambulance even came to a complete stop for nearly 5 minutes when her condition worsened. Diana was bleeding internally from a tear to her pulmonary vein. The journey of just 3.8 miles took an astonishing 1 hour and 43 minutes. Medical experts later testified that Diana's injury was potentially survivable with immediate surgery. Every minute delayed increased her blood loss. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her body gradually shutting down. By the time Diana reached reached the hospital, her heart had shifted to the right side of her chest from internal bleeding. Emergency surgery couldn't save her. At 4:53 a.m., the Princess of Wales was pronounced dead. Not from an unsurvivable crash, but from a failed rescue that took too long. Taconic State Parkway wrong-way crash. On July 26, 2009, a red minivan traveled 1.7 miles in the wrong direction on New York's Taconic State Parkway. Behind the wheel was 36-year-old Diance Schuler, a cable television executive who was returning from a camping trip with her 2 children and 3 nieces. What unfolded would become one of the most disturbing failed rescue attempts in highway history. Multiple drivers called 911, frantically reporting a minivan heading directly into oncoming traffic at high speed. "There's a car going the wrong way on the Taconic," one caller shouted. Police were dispatched, but they couldn't intercept the vehicle in time. The window for prevention closed with each passing second. At 1:35 p.m., Schuler's minivan collided head-on with a Chevrolet Trailblazer at combined speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic, tearing open the minivan's fuel tank and igniting a fire. 3 men in the SUV died instantly from the collision. Inside Schuler's vehicle, only her 5-year-old son Brian survived the initial impact. When emergency responders arrived minutes later, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. The minivan was engulfed in flames. Inside were Schuler's daughter Emma, 8, and her 3 nieces, Allison, 8, Kate, 5, and Aaron, 2. Rescuers could hear the children's cries from within the burning wreckage. Firefighters rushed forward with extinguishers and hoses, but the gasoline-fed flames were too intense to approach. The heat kept pushing them back as they made desperate attempts to reach the children. One firefighter suffered severe burns trying to force open a door. Through the flames, they could see small hands pressing against the windows. The fire consumed the oxygen inside the vehicle. The children's cries grew weaker, then stopped altogether as toxic smoke filled their lungs. By the time firefighters managed to control the flames enough to reach the vehicle, it was too late. Everyone except Brian had perished either from the impact or the fire. Later toxicology reports revealed Schuler had a blood alcohol level of 0.19 and high levels of THC in her system, making the failed rescue attempt all the more tragic. It should never have happened at all. Caldecott Tunnel disaster. On April 7, 1982, California's Caldecott Tunnel, connecting Oakland and Orinda, became the site of one of America's most haunting failed rescue attempts. What began as a minor accident escalated into an inferno that trapped victims just beyond rescuers' reach. At 12:17 a.m., a drunk driver's Volkswagen Rabbit stalled in the tunnel's third bore. Moments later, an AC transit bus struck the disabled car. The initial collision was survivable. No one was seriously injured. Then came the sound that would change everything. The rumble of an approaching double-tanker truck. The tanker, carrying 8,800 gallons of gasoline, couldn't stop in time. It slammed into the bus, rupturing its tanks. Gasoline poured across the roadway and ignited instantly. The temperature inside the tunnel soared to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. Among those trapped was the Mack family, Richard and Connie, along with their children Evelyn and Richard Jr., in their Volkswagen Rabbit. The initial crash hadn't harmed them. The fire that followed gave them no escape. First responders arrived quickly, but faced an impossible situation. The tunnel's ventilation system, designed to clear exhaust, now fed oxygen to the inferno, creating a blast furnace effect. Firefighters made 3 separate rescue attempts, pushing into the superheated tunnel with hoses and breathing apparatus. Each time, they were driven back by the unbearable heat. Veteran firefighters described it as walking into an oven. Through the flames, rescuers could see the silhouettes of vehicles with people still inside. Most disturbing of all were the sounds. They could hear the Mack family calling for help. "We can hear them screaming," one firefighter reported over the radio. "We just can't get to them." The family was less than 100 feet away, but it might as well have been miles. The wall of fire between rescuers and victims was impenetrable. Inside their car, the Mack family huddled together as temperatures rose. Plastic components melted, then metal began to warp. Their calls grew weaker as oxygen depleted. Carbon monoxide rendered them unconscious before the flames reached them. 7 people died that night, their final moments spent aware that help was tantalizingly close, but ultimately unreachable. Wolfgang von Trips. In September 1961, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza drew the elite of Formula One racing. Among them was Count Wolfgang von Trips, a German nobleman whose aristocratic background seemed at odds with the dangerous world of motor racing. Von Trips was just 2 races away from securing the world championship for Ferrari, a position that had put him at the center of attention that weekend. On lap 2 of the race, von Trips' Ferrari was traveling at over 150 miles per hour on the approach to the Parabolica curve. Alongside him was Jim Clark's Lotus. In a split second, their wheels touched. The contact was minimal, but at such speeds it was disastrous. Von Trips' Ferrari became instantly unstable. The car pitched sideways, then became airborne. Like a missile without guidance, the Ferrari sailed toward the spectator area, where fans stood watching behind a low fence. They had no time to react. The car slammed into the crowd and fence with savage force. Metal twisted and shredded. The impact threw Von Trips from his cockpit, his body tumbling across the ground like a rag doll. His helmet tore off. His unprotected head struck the track surface repeatedly. Witnesses described a scene of chaos and horror. Blood stained the grass. 15 spectators lay dead or dying, their bodies broken by the impact of the Ferrari or sliced by its metal components. Emergency services were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Von Trips himself lay motionless on the track. His neck had been broken in the violent ejection from the car. He had died instantly upon impact with the ground, his body still warm as officials reached him. The race continued despite the tragedy. As cars roared past the accident scene, officials covered Von Trips' body with a tarpaulin. The Germans' championship dreams ended there on the Monza asphalt. His life cut short at 33, and his title hopes handed to his teammate Phil Hill, who became world champion that day. Ayrton Senna. On May 1st, 1994, the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola was under a dark cloud. Just one day earlier, Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger had died during qualifying. Despite this, Ayrton Senna, the three-time world champion and arguably the greatest Formula One driver in history, took his place on the starting grid. His Williams car sat in pole position, a familiar spot for the Brazilian master. The race began, and Senna pulled away as expected. On the 7th lap, his car entered the high-speed Tamburello corner at approximately 190 miles per hour. What happened next would be scrutinized for years to come. The Williams suddenly veered off course, continuing straight where the track curved left. In the final seconds, telemetry showed Senna desperately trying to slow the car. He managed to reduce his speed to about 135 miles per hour before impact, but it wasn't enough. The Williams slammed into the concrete barrier at an angle that proved fatal. Upon impact, a piece of the suspension broke free. Like a javelin, it pierced through the carbon fiber helmet and into Senna's head. The right front tire and suspension assembly were driven back into the cockpit, striking his helmet with tremendous force. Blood pooled inside his helmet immediately. When medical teams reached him, Senna was still sitting in his car, motionless but alive. His head tilted slightly, blood seeping from underneath his visor. Track doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy at the scene, knowing every second was critical. The helicopter waited to transport him to Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. Though his heart was still beating, brain scans revealed devastating injuries. At 6:40 p.m., doctors announced what millions feared. Ayrton Senna was dead. Brazil declared the 3 days of national mourning. An estimated 3 million people lined the streets of Sao Paulo for his funeral procession. The driver who had seemed invincible on track was gone at 34, his legend immortalized in that final fatal moment at Tamburello. Roland Ratzenberger. On April 30th, 1994, the qualifying session for the San Marino Grand Prix was underway at Imola. Roland Ratzenberger, an Austrian driver competing in only his third Formula One race, was pushing hard in his Simtek Ford. At 34, Ratzenberger was older than most rookies, having worked his way up through the ranks of motorsport with determination rather than fanfare. During his fast lap, Ratzenberger's car struck a curb at the Acque Minerali chicane. The impact damaged his front wing, but instead of returning to the pits, he continued his qualifying run. Engineers watching from the pit wall could see the wing wobbling precariously as the car sped down the straight. As he approached the Villeneuve curve at over 190 miles per hour, the compromised carbon fiber wing finally failed. In an instant, it folded under the car, eliminating all downforce and rendering the Simtek uncontrollable. Ratzenberger was now merely a passenger in a missile without guidance. The car veered sharply to the right. Onboard telemetry recorded a momentary desperate correction on the steering wheel before impact. It was futile. The Simtek slammed into the concrete wall at barely diminished speed. The impact was so violent that Ratzenberger's head snapped forward against the cockpit, causing a basilar skull fracture. The safety harness that kept him in the car became the mechanism of fatal injury as his body stayed fixed while his head moved violently forward. When marshals reached the scene, Ratzenberger was motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Medical teams worked frantically, removing him from the wreckage and beginning CPR. A helicopter waited nearby to evacuate him to Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. Despite their efforts, Ratzenberger was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause was listed as a basilar skull fracture, an injury that would later lead to mandatory head and neck support devices in motorsport. His death, though soon overshadowed by Senna's the following day, marked the first fatality in a Grand Prix weekend in 12 years. Tom Pryce. On March 5, 1977, the South African Grand Prix was underway at Kyalami. Tom Pryce, a talented Welsh driver for the Shadow team, was known for his natural speed and quiet determination. At 27, he was considered a future champion by many in the paddock, his career just beginning to flourish in the dangerous world of 1970s Formula One. On lap 22, Renzo Zorzi's car pulled off the track with a minor engine fire. 2 marshals from the opposite side of the circuit ran across the track to assist with fire extinguishers. The first made it across safely. The second, 19-year-old Frederik Jansen van Vuren, was not so fortunate. As Pryce crested the rise after the main straight, he was traveling at approximately 170 miles per hour. The marshal suddenly appeared in front of him, crossing directly into his path. There was no time to react, no possibility of avoidance. The impact was devastating. The shadow hit Van Vuren with such force that the marshal's body was thrown high into the air, landing hundreds of feet away. His body was so badly mutilated that officials initially could not identify which marshal it was. But the horror did not end there. The 40-pound fire extinguisher that Van Vuren had been carrying was struck by Pryce's car. It became a deadly projectile, flying directly into Pryce's face at relative speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. The extinguisher struck Pryce's helmet with devastating force, partially lifting his helmet and causing fatal injuries to his head. The impact was so severe that the full-face helmet offered no meaningful protection. Pryce's car continued down the straight, no longer controlled by its driver. With Pryce already dead at the wheel, the shadow veered into Jacques Laffitte's Ligier, before finally coming to rest. When officials reached the car, they found Pryce still strapped in the cockpit, his face unrecognizable from the impact. The race continued around the 2 covered bodies on and near the circuit, the red flag procedures of the era not deemed necessary for these deaths. Ronnie Peterson. On September 10, 1978, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza began in chaos. Ronnie Peterson, the Swedish driver nicknamed Super Swede for his spectacular driving style, was in his Black Lotus starting from the grid's midfield. Tall, blonde, and universally liked in the paddock, Peterson was one of Formula One's most popular figures. As the lights changed, the pack of powerful cars accelerated toward the first chicane. The narrow track couldn't accommodate the 24 cars fighting for position. James Hunt's McLaren veered slightly, touching another car. In an instant, what had been an orderly grid became a mass of spinning, colliding machinery. Peterson's Lotus was pushed into the barriers at high speed. The impact was violent, crushing the front of the car and trapping his legs in the twisted metal. Within seconds, the wreckage erupted in flames. Fuel from ruptured tanks ignited, surrounding Peterson in fire. Several drivers, including James Hunt, stopped and ran back to the burning Lotus. They pulled Peterson from the inferno before he suffered severe burns, but the damage to his legs was already done. Both were badly broken, with multiple compound fractures clearly visible as they laid him on the track surface. When medical crews arrived, Peterson was conscious and talking. His injuries, while serious, didn't appear life-threatening. He was transported to Niguarda Hospital in Milan, where x-rays confirmed at least 27 fractures in his legs and feet. Doctors decided to operate immediately to stabilize the fractures. What no one realized was that bone marrow from the multiple fractures had already entered Peterson's bloodstream. During the night, he developed fat embolism syndrome. Tiny globules of fat began blocking small blood vessels in his lungs and brain. His breathing became labored. His organs started failing one by one as oxygen couldn't reach his tissues. By morning, Peterson was in critical condition. His wife, Barbara, rushed to his bedside but arrived too late. At 9:55 a.m. on September 11th, Ronnie Peterson died at age 34, not from burns or immediate trauma, but from the insidious internal damage that no one had detected in time. Jules Bianchi. On October 5th, 2014, the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka was being lashed by torrential rain from an approaching typhoon. The race had started under safety car conditions and visibility was poor. Jules Bianchi, a 25-year-old French driver for Marussia and a Ferrari Academy prospect, was fighting hard to earn his team valuable championship points. By lap 43, the rain had intensified. Adrian Seudel-Sauber had already aquaplaned off the track at the Dunlop curve, hitting the tire barrier. A recovery crane had been dispatched to remove Seudel's car, positioned just beyond the runoff area. As Bianchi approached the same corner, his car began to hydroplane on the wet surface. He lost control at approximately 134 miles per hour, sliding off at virtually the same point as Seudel had moments before. But unlike Seudel, Bianchi's trajectory took him directly toward the recovery vehicle. The Marussia slid beneath the rear of the 13-ton crane. There was no safety skirt to prevent such an intrusion. The impact sheared off the roll hoop of Bianchi's car and caused a deceleration measured at 254 G, among the highest ever recorded in motorsport. The blow was crushing. Bianchi's helmet struck the underside of the crane with tremendous force. Although the carbon fiber shell remained intact, the sudden deceleration caused devastating diffuse axonal injury to his brain. When medical teams reached him, he was unconscious, but breathing. Carefully extracted from the destroyed cockpit, Bianchi was transported by ambulance to Mee University Hospital. Neurosurgeons performed immediate emergency surgery to address the critical brain trauma, but the prognosis was grim from the start. Bianchi never regained consciousness. For 9 months, he remained in a coma, his family maintaining a constant vigil. Machines kept him breathing, while doctors repeatedly explained the irreversible nature of his brain injuries. On July 17, 2015, Jules Bianchi died at a hospital in Nice, France, still just 25 years old. He became the first driver to die from racing injuries in Formula One in 21 years, breaking a safety record that the sport had been proud of since Ayrton Senna's death. Jochen Rindt, on September 5, 1970, qualifying for the Italian Grand Prix was underway at the Monza circuit. Jochen Rindt, an Austrian driver known for his spectacular car control and fearless style, was leading the championship by a substantial margin. At 28, he had finally secured a competitive car with the Lotus team, after years of struggle in less reliable machinery. Rindt was pushing hard during the session, determined to secure pole position despite concerns about his car's safety. The Lotus 72 was fast but fragile, its designer Colin Chapman infamous for building cars that were light, innovative, and often on the edge of structural integrity. As Rindt approached the Parabolica corner at approximately 175 miles per hour, something went catastrophically wrong. Later investigation would reveal that a brake shaft had failed, causing a sudden and complete loss of braking power. In that split second, Rindt became a passenger in an uncontrollable machine. The Lotus veered sharply to the left, skidding across the track toward the guardrail. There was no runoff area in 1970, just a thin metal barrier between the track and the trees beyond. The Lotus slammed underneath the guardrail at tremendous speed, the metal edge slicing through the front of the car like a knife. Rindt was wearing only a lap belt, having refused to use the available shoulder straps because they inhibited his movement in the cockpit. This decision proved fatal. As the car violently decelerated, Rindt's body continued forward. The impact forced him down in the cockpit, the edge of the steering wheel crushing his throat and chest against the lap belt. When track workers reached the scene, they found Rindt still alive but unconscious and gravely injured. His throat had been severely traumatized, cutting off his airway. Despite frantic efforts to save him, Jochen Rindt was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. The season continued without him, but no driver could overcome Rindt's points laid. 2 months later, he became Formula One's only posthumous world champion, his widow Nina collecting the trophy he would never hold. François Cevert. On October 6, 1973, the final qualifying session for the United States Grand Prix was underway at Watkins Glen. François Cevert, the handsome 29-year-old French driver for Tyrrell, was being groomed as the successor to his teammate and mentor Jackie Stewart. With his movie star looks and natural speed, Cevert represented the future of Formula One, a rising star in a dangerous era. Stewart was set to retire after this race, his 100th Grand Prix, and had been teaching Cevert everything he knew. The Frenchman was determined to show his readiness to lead the team with a strong qualifying performance that Saturday morning. As Cevert approached the challenging uphill S's section at approximately 150 miles per hour, his Tyrrell suddenly snapped to the right. What caused the initial loss of control would never be definitively determined. The car struck the right side guardrail with tremendous force, then ricocheted across the track into the left side barrier. The second impact was even more violent than the first. The Tyrrell hit at such an angle that it was launched into a terrifying series of rotations. The car began to disintegrate, parts scattering across the track as the monocoque twisted and contorted. The force was so extreme that the guardrail buckled, creating a gap that allowed the car to partially pass through. When the Tyrrell finally came to rest, it was nearly unrecognizable. The blue car had been torn apart, with Cevert still strapped inside what remained of the cockpit. The barriers had sliced through the vehicle, effectively cutting it in two. Jackie Stewart, following behind on track, came upon the scene moments later. He immediately recognized the destroyed blue car and stopped. What he saw was so horrific that he would later refuse to describe it in detail. Cevert had suffered fatal injuries, his body partially dismembered by the metal barriers. Death had been instantaneous. Officials quickly covered the wreckage with a tarpaulin. The Tyrrell team immediately withdrew from the race, Jackie Stewart's illustrious career ending not with a final race, but with the death of his protege. Piers Courage. On June 21, 1970, the Dutch Grand Prix was being held at the Zandvoort circuit. Piers Courage, a British driver from a wealthy brewing family, was piloting a De Tomaso car for the Frank Williams team. At 28, Courage was known for his aristocratic background and devil-may-care attitude, a throwback to the gentleman racers of an earlier era. By lap 23, Courage was pushing hard, the De Tomaso's Ford Cosworth engine howling as he navigated the circuit's flowing curves. As he approached the fast right-hander at Tunnel Oost, disaster struck. The suspension on his car suddenly failed, likely due to metal fatigue that had gone undetected. Without warning, the De Tomaso veered off the track at nearly 150 miles per hour. The car slammed into the soft sand that lined the circuit, digging in and beginning a violent series of rolls. With each impact, pieces of the car were torn away. One of the front wheels, still attached to its suspension assembly, was ripped off and sent flying. In a cruel twist of fate, this wheel and suspension unit came down directly on the cockpit area. The impact was violent, causing fatal head injuries to Courage instantly. But what followed made the scene even more horrific. The magnesium components of the De Tomaso's chassis, lightweight but highly flammable, ignited upon impact. Within seconds, the wreckage was engulfed in intense white-hot flames that burned at over 3,000 degrees. Magnesium fires cannot be extinguished by conventional means, and the heat was so intense that marshals could not approach. Inside the burning chassis, Courage's body was consumed by the inferno. The heat was so extreme that even his helmet melted in the blaze. Track workers stood helplessly by, unable to intervene as the fire burned with unstoppable ferocity. When the flames finally subsided, leaving only a blackened chassis, medical officials were faced with the grim task of recovering what remained. The severity of the fire had made the scene nearly unrecognizable as a racing car. The race continued, with Jackie Stewart eventually taking victory, though his celebrations were notably subdued. Riccardo Paletti. On June 13, 1982, the Canadian Grand Prix was about to begin on the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal. Among the drivers on the grid was Riccardo Paletti, a 23-year-old Italian rookie competing in only his second Formula One race. Driving for the small Osella team, Paletti was determined to make his mark in the sport after a difficult debut at the Monaco Grand Prix earlier that season. As the starter raised the green flag, Didier Pironi's Ferrari stalled on pole position. Yellow warning lights flashed. But in the days before sophisticated radio communications, many drivers at the back had no way of knowing about the stationary car ahead. The field began to navigate around the stranded Ferrari, but Paletti, starting from the back, had limited visibility. By the time he saw Pironi's car, it was too late. Paletti's Osella slammed into the back of the Ferrari at nearly 110 miles per hour. The impact was so violent that the front of Paletti's car was completely crushed, driving the front suspension and engine back into the cockpit where Paletti sat strapped in. The young Italian was pinned in the wreckage, conscious but unable to move as his chest was crushed against the steering column. Rescue workers frantically tried to reach him, but their efforts were complicated when fuel began leaking from the ruptured tanks. Just 30 seconds after the initial impact, the spilled fuel ignited. Flames engulfed the wrecked Osella with Paletti still trapped inside. Pironi and several marshals fought the fire with extinguishers, temporarily keeping the flames at bay long enough for medical personnel to reach Paletti. When they finally extracted him from the burning wreckage, Paletti was still alive but barely breathing. His chest had been crushed on impact, causing massive internal injuries. He was immediately transported to the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, where doctors fought desperately to save him. Despite their best efforts, the trauma was too severe. Riccardo Paletti was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, having suffered fatal chest injuries from the initial impact rather than the subsequent fire. Mark Donohue. On August 17, 1975, practice for the Austrian Grand Prix was underway at the Österreich-Ring. Mark Donohue, an American racing driver known as Captain Nice for his analytical approach and engineering background, was behind the wheel of his Penske-owned March. At 38, he had already achieved success in numerous racing disciplines, from Can-Am to NASCAR, even winning the Indianapolis 500. As Donohue approached a fast section of the circuit, a tire on his March suddenly failed. The car veered off the track at high speed, careening toward the barriers. In a desperate attempt to slow the car, Donohue managed to steer away from the solid guardrail, instead crashing into a set of catch fencing and advertising hoardings. The impact wasn't particularly violent by Formula One standards. The car broke through the fencing and came to rest without the devastating damage typically seen in fatal accidents. Donohue was able to extract himself from the car and stand on his own. He appeared shaken but largely unharmed, complaining only of a headache. Track medical staff examined him briefly at the scene and found no obvious injuries. The headache was dismissed as a likely result of the impact, something routine for racing drivers of the era. Donohue walked away from the crash, returning to his hotel to rest. During the night, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The headache intensified to unbearable levels. By morning, Donohue was vomiting and confused, classic symptoms of what doctors would later identify as a cerebral hemorrhage. A seemingly minor piece of debris had struck his helmet during the crash, causing bleeding inside his brain that was slowly building pressure. By the time he reached the hospital in Graz, Donohue was slipping in and out of consciousness. Surgeons operated immediately to relieve the pressure on his brain, but the internal damage was too extensive. Mark Donohue died 2 days after the accident without regaining consciousness, the delayed nature of his fatal injury leaving teammates and friends in shock. What had seemed like a minor incident had claimed one of racing's most respected figures through an invisible, creeping death. Patrick Depailler. On August 1, 1980, the Hockenheimring in Germany was quiet except for the sound of a single Formula One car. Patrick Depailler, the 35-year-old French driver known for his flamboyant driving style and passion for motorcycles, was conducting a private test session for the Alfa Romeo team. The weekend's German Grand Prix was approaching, and Depailler was determined to improve the car's setup. The Hockenheim circuit of 1980 was a fearsome track with long straights cutting through dense forest. The most challenging section was the Ostkurve, a fast left-hand bend that required required absolute precision and commitment. Drivers approached it at over 170 miles per hour with only thin barriers separating them from the trees beyond. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Depailler was on his fourth lap of the day. As he entered the Ostkurve, something on the car failed completely. Later investigation suggested a suspension component had broken, though some speculated that a tire failure was to blame. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The Alfa Romeo became instantly uncontrollable at maximum speed. The car snapped sideways, then became airborne. For a brief moment, the red machine flew through the air before slamming into the Armco barriers with devastating force. The impact was so violent that the car disintegrated, pieces scattering across the track and into the forest. The cockpit section, with Depailler still strapped inside, came to rest against the mangled barriers. There was no fire, but the damage to the car and driver had already been done. The impact forces had caused massive trauma to Depailler's body, crushing his chest and head. When track workers reached the wreckage, they found Depailler motionless. There was no need for medical intervention. The force of the crash had killed him instantly. His body remained in the twisted cockpit, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, a final testament to a racer who never lifted off the throttle. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. Depailler, a man who had survived countless motorcycle accidents and previously broken both legs in a hang-gliding crash, had died while testing safety improvements to a car that ultimately could not save him. Helmuth Koinigg. On October 6, 1974, the United States Grand Prix was underway at Watkins Glen. Helmuth Koinigg, a 25-year-old Austrian rookie, was driving the uncompetitive Surtees car in only his second Formula One race. Despite his limited experience at the sport's highest level, he had shown promise and a methodical approach to learning the difficult track. On the 10th lap, Koinigg was navigating the challenging Watkins Glen circuit when disaster struck in the most mundane form. His right front tire suddenly deflated as he approached the sweeping right-hander at the end of the straight. Under normal circumstances, such a failure would lead to a controlled slide into the barriers, uncomfortable but rarely fatal. The car skidded off the track at approximately 140 miles per hour. Koinigg braced for impact as the Surtees approached the guardrail. What should have been a simple barrier designed to absorb energy and protect drivers, instead became the instrument of his death. The bottom portion of the guardrail had been improperly installed. When Koinigg's car hit the barrier, instead of deflecting or crumpling as designed, the metal rail gave way at the bottom while remaining intact at the top. This created a deadly guillotine effect. The Surtees slid underneath the top portion of the guardrail with terrible precision. The metal edge of the barrier struck the cockpit exactly at Koinigg's eye level. In an instant, the top of his helmet and his head were severed cleanly from his body. When track marshals reached the scene seconds later, they were confronted with a horror beyond imagination. Koinigg's body remained strapped in the driving position, the safety harness having functioned perfectly to keep his torso in place. But where his head should have been, there was nothing. The race continued as Koinigg's covered body was removed from the track. The public announcement merely stated that the Austrian had been involved in an accident, the Jayne Mansfield crash incident. On June 29, 1967, Jayne Mansfield prepared for a late-night drive from Biloxi to New Orleans. The 34-year-old Hollywood actress had just finished a nightclub performance at the Gus Stevens Supper Club. Mansfield sat in the front passenger seat of a 1966 Buick Electra 225. Her boyfriend, lawyer Sam Brody, occupied the seat behind the driver. Ronnie Harrison, a 20-year-old driver, sat behind the wheel. In the back seat, 3 children slept peacefully. Mariska Hargitay, age 3, and her 2 brothers, Mickey 6 and Zoltan 8. The group departed Biloxi around 12:30 a.m. Highway 90 stretched ahead through the Louisiana darkness. Dense fog had settled over the coastal highway, reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile. The Buick's headlights cut through the humid air as Harrison maintained highway speed. Mansfield wore a blonde wig and had been drinking earlier in the evening. The children remained asleep in the back seat, unaware of the journey ahead. Around 2:25 a.m., the Buick approached a construction zone near Slidell, Louisiana. A truck ahead was spraying pesticide to control the mosquito population, creating additional fog and reducing visibility even further. The spray truck moved slowly, about 15 miles per hour, with a large tank trailer following behind it. Warning signs and flares marked the construction area, but the dense fog obscured them from approaching traffic. Harrison failed to see the slow-moving vehicles ahead. The Buick was traveling approximately 70 miles per hour when it approached the rear of the tractor trailer. The fog had become so thick that the truck's taillights were barely visible. Harrison had less than 2 seconds to react once he spotted the obstacle ahead. The Buick struck the rear of the trailer at nearly full highway speed. The car's front end dove underneath the trailer's rear bumper. The trailer's underside, positioned at exactly the height of the car's roofline, acted like a blade. The impact sheared off the entire top portion of the Buick's passenger compartment. The roof was severed cleanly at window level, crushing everything above the dashboard. The 3 adults in the front seat died instantly from massive head trauma. Mansfield's blonde wig was torn from her head and thrown onto the highway, leading to widespread but false reports that she had been decapitated. Brody and Harrison also suffered fatal head injuries from the trailer's underside. The force of the impact drove the car forward several more feet before it came to rest beneath the trailer. The children in the back seat survived the crash with various injuries. The rear portion of the car remained largely intact, protecting them from the trailer that had crushed the front compartment. Mariska Hargitay suffered a small scar above her right eye that remains visible today. Her brother sustained cuts and bruises, but no life-threatening injuries. Emergency responders arrived at the scene within minutes of the crash. The fog continued to hamper rescue efforts and created dangerous conditions for other vehicles approaching the accident site. Paramedics pronounced the 3 adults dead at the scene. The children were transported to a local hospital for treatment of their injuries. The crash led to federal requirements for rear underride guards on large trucks, designed to prevent cars from sliding underneath trailers during rear-end collisions. The Ricardo Hornos burning car crash incident. On March 15, 1987, Riccardo Hornos finished his shift at a downtown San Francisco office building. The 28-year-old maintenance supervisor walked to his car in the parking garage. Hornos drove a 1985 Honda Civic that he had purchased 6 months earlier. The compact car had 87,000 miles on the odometer and needed minor repairs, but it provided reliable transportation for his daily commute to his home in Daly City. Rain had been falling steadily since early afternoon. The storm created slick conditions on Highway 101 where standing water collected in low-lying sections of roadway. Hornos merged onto the southbound lanes around 6:15 p.m., joining the heavy evening traffic. Visibility was reduced due to spray from other vehicles and the steady rainfall. Most drivers had reduced their speed to account for the wet conditions. About 12 miles south of downtown, traffic began to slow near the Candlestick Park exit. A minor fender bender in the right lane had created a bottleneck, forcing vehicles to merge left. Cars were moving at approximately 25 miles per hour in stop-and-go patterns. Hornos followed about 3 car lengths behind a delivery truck, maintaining a safe distance on the wet pavement. A panel van in the left lane suddenly lost control on a patch of standing water. The driver overcorrected, sending the van skidding sideways across 2 lanes of traffic. The van struck the delivery truck in front of Hornos, causing a chain reaction collision. The truck jackknifed into Hornos' Honda, pushing it into the concrete center barrier at about 35 miles per hour. The impact with the barrier ruptured the Honda's fuel tank. Gasoline spilled onto the hot exhaust system and ignited immediately. Flames spread rapidly under the car and began entering the passenger compartment through gaps in the floor pan. Dense black smoke filled the interior within seconds, making it impossible for Hornos to see the door handles or window controls. Hornos tried to open the driver's door, but the impact had jammed the mechanism. The door handle moved freely but would not engage the latch. He attempted to roll down the window using the manual crank, but the handle had broken off during the collision. Hornos then tried to reach across to the passenger door, but his seatbelt had locked in place and would not release. The buckle appeared to be functioning normally, but the mechanism would not disengage under pressure. The fire spread rapidly through the engine compartment and began melting the plastic dashboard components. Toxic fumes from burning vinyl and foam filled the car's interior. Hornos covered his nose and mouth with his shirt sleeve, but the smoke continued to penetrate his lungs. He could hear other drivers outside attempting to break the windows with tools and rocks from the roadside. 2 truck drivers stopped their vehicles and ran to assist. They struck the rear window repeatedly with a tire iron, but the safety glass held together despite forming spiderweb cracks. The front windshield proved equally resistant to their efforts. The fire had grown too intense for them to approach the driver's side door, where flames were now visible through the windows. By the time emergency crews arrived, the Honda was fully engulfed in flames. Firefighters deployed foam to suppress the blaze, but the intense heat prevented immediate rescue attempts. The car's interior temperature had reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hornos had succumbed to smoke inhalation and thermal injuries before rescuers could extract him from the vehicle. The fire department required nearly 20 minutes to extinguish the blaze and cool the wreckage sufficiently for recovery operations. Investigation revealed that the fuel tank rupture and subsequent fire were caused by the specific angle of impact with the barrier, which drove sharp metal fragments into the tank wall. The Ryan Fellows drag racing crash incident. On August 7, 2022, Ryan Fellows arrived at Las Vegas Motor Speedway for filming with the Discovery Channel's Street Outlaws television series. The 41-year-old drag racer from Amarillo, Texas, had been competing professionally for over 15 years. Fellows drove a heavily modified 1998 Nissan 240SX that produced over 1,200 horsepower through its turbocharged engine. The car featured a full roll cage, 5-point racing harness, fire suppression system, and other safety equipment required for professional drag racing. The filming session was part of the show's No Prep Kings series, where drivers compete on tracks without traditional drag racing preparation like traction compound. Fellows had competed in dozens of similar events across the country. The Las Vegas Motor Speedway provided a controlled environment with professional safety crews, medical personnel, and proper emergency equipment stationed throughout the facility. Fellows completed his pre-run safety checks around 3:30 p.m. The crew verified that his helmet was properly secured and that all safety systems were functioning correctly. The ambient temperature was 102 degrees Fahrenheit, creating challenging conditions for both engines and tires. The track's surface temperature exceeded 140 degrees, reducing available traction for the high-powered vehicles. During the 8th mile pass, Fellows' Nissan accelerated normally off the starting line. The car reached approximately 180 miles per hour by the 660-foot mark, running slightly quicker than his qualifying time from earlier in the day. Onboard telemetry later showed the engine was producing full power, and all systems were operating within normal parameters. Fellows maintained control through the middle section of the track. At approximately the 1,000-foot mark, traveling near 200 miles per hour, the car suddenly veered toward the right side of the track. The rear suspension appeared to fail, causing the vehicle to lose directional stability. Fellows attempted to correct the slide, but the extreme speed made recovery impossible. The car began rotating clockwise as it left the prepared racing surface. The Nissan struck the concrete barrier at an oblique angle while still traveling at approximately 150 miles per hour. The initial impact occurred on the passenger side, causing the vehicle to launch to the air and begin tumbling. The car completed 2 full rotations before striking the barrier a second time, this time on the roof and driver's side. The roll cage absorbed much of the impact energy, but the forces exceeded the structure's design limits. Safety crews reached the wreckage within 90 seconds of the impact. The car had come to rest upright but was heavily damaged throughout the passenger compartment. Fellows remained conscious initially and were able to respond to rescue personnel. The safety crews used hydraulic tools to remove sections of the roll cage and extract him from the vehicle. The extraction process required 12 minutes due to the extent of structural damage. Fellows was transported by helicopter to University Medical Center in Las Vegas, arriving within 30 minutes of the crash. Medical personnel worked to stabilize his condition, but the injuries sustained during the high-speed impact were too severe. Fellows had suffered massive internal trauma despite the protection provided by his safety equipment. He died from his injuries at 6:47 p.m., approximately 3 hours after the accident. The crash investigation revealed that a rear suspension component had failed due to metal fatigue, causing the loss of control. The part had been inspected according to racing protocols, but microscopic cracks had developed from repeated stress loading during previous races. The Diance Schuler wrong-way crash incident. On July 26, 2009, Diance Schuler loaded 5 children into her 2003 Ford Windstar minivan at Hunter Lake Campground in Parksville, New York. The 36-year-old mother from West Babylon had spent the weekend camping with her family. Schuler was driving her 2 children, Aaron 2 and Brian 5, along with her 3 nieces, Emma Hance 8, Allison Hance 7, and Katie Hance 5. The children had enjoyed swimming and hiking during their weekend getaway and were looking forward to returning home. Schuler began the drive home around 9:30 a.m. The route would take them south on Route 17 through the Catskill Mountains before connecting to other highways leading back to Long Island. Schuler had made this drive many times before and was familiar with the roads. She stopped at a McDonald's in Liberty, New York around 10:30 a.m. to purchase breakfast for the children and use the restroom. Video surveillance from the McDonald's showed Schuler appeared normal during the stop. She walked steadily, interacted normally with the cashier, and helped the children with their food. The group spent about 15 minutes at the restaurant before continuing their journey. Schuler purchased coffee, and the children ate Egg McMuffins and hash browns during the stop. Around 11:37 a.m., Schuler stopped at a Sunoco gas station in Liberty. She purchased a bottle of Absolute vodka and some orange juice. Surveillance cameras captured her making these purchases alone, while the children remained in the minivan. Schuler appeared to move normally and showed no obvious signs of impairment during this transaction. She paid cash for the items and returned to the vehicle. At approximately 1:02 p.m., Schuler called her brother Warren Hance from her cell phone. She told him she was not feeling well and was having trouble seeing clearly. Hans offered to come get them, but Schuler said she would pull over and wait for him. The call lasted about 4 minutes, and Hans immediately left his home to drive north and locate them. This would be their final conversation. Around 1:15 p.m., Schuler entered the Taconic State Parkway going the wrong direction at the Pleasantville Road interchange. The parkway is a divided highway with a grass median separating northbound and southbound traffic. Schuler drove south in the northbound lanes for 1.7 miles, traveling directly into oncoming traffic. Multiple drivers called 911 to report the wrong-way vehicle. The first 911 call came in at 1:33 p.m. from a motorist who reported seeing a red minivan driving south in the northbound lanes near Briarcliff Manor. Additional calls followed from other drivers who had to swerve to avoid collisions. State police immediately dispatched units to intercept the vehicle, but Schuler continued driving at approximately 70 miles per hour against traffic. At 1:35 p.m., Schuler's minivan collided head-on with a 2004 Chevrolet Trailblazer driven by Michael Bastardi, 81. The SUV also carried Bastardi's son Guy, 49, and their family friend Daniel Longo, 74. The impact occurred at a combined speed of approximately 140 miles per hour as both vehicles were traveling at highway speeds in opposite directions. The collision completely destroyed both vehicles. Schuler died instantly from massive trauma, as did 4 of the 5 children in her van. The 3 men in the SUV were also killed immediately upon impact. Only Schuler's 5-year-old son Brian survived the crash, suffering broken bones and severe injuries but remaining conscious. Emergency responders found him hanging upside down in his car seat, crying but alert. The Fireball Roberts NASCAR crash incident. On May 24, 1964, Glenn Fireball Roberts arrived at Charlotte Motor Speedway for the World 600 race. The 35-year-old NASCAR champion from Daytona Beach, Florida, had won 33 races in his career and was considered one of the sport's most skilled drivers. Roberts drove a white and gold Ford Galaxy 500 for Holman Moody Racing, one of NASCAR's premier teams. The car featured a 427 cubic inch V8 engine producing over 400 horsepower and could reach speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour on Charlotte's high-banked oval. Safety equipment in 1964 NASCAR was minimal compared to modern standards. Roberts wore a standard helmet and seatbelt, but roll bars were primitive and fire suppression systems did not exist. The fuel cell was a basic metal tank mounted in the trunk area without modern safety bladders or foam filling. Drivers wore cotton uniforms that provided little protection against fire. The cars carried no onboard fire extinguishers or emergency shutoff systems. The race began at 6 p.m. under overcast skies with temperatures in the mid-80s. Roberts started from the 3rd position and quickly moved toward the front of the field. His Ford handled well in the early laps, and he was running in 2nd place when the first caution flag appeared on lap 7. Roberts had been averaging over 140 miles per hour on the 1.5-mile tri-oval, maintaining close contact with race leader Fred Lorenzen. As the field bunched up for the restart, Roberts was running directly behind Ned Jarrett's Ford in the inside line. The cars were traveling approximately 100 miles per hour when Jarrett's vehicle suddenly slowed due to engine problems. Roberts had less than 1 second to react as Jarrett's car dropped back toward his position. The closing speed between the two vehicles was nearly 40 miles per hour. Roberts attempted to steer left to avoid Jarrett, but Junior Johnson's Dodge was already occupying that position. With nowhere to go, Roberts' Ford struck Jarrett's rear bumper and became airborne. The car flipped twice before landing upside down in a shower of sparks along the concrete retaining wall. The impact ruptured the fuel tank, and gasoline sprayed across the hot exhaust system and engine components. Fire erupted immediately as the fuel ignited. Roberts remained conscious and trapped inside the overturned vehicle as flames engulfed the cockpit area. The fuel continued, feeding the fire, creating temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit around the driver's compartment. Roberts struggled to free himself from the seatbelt and crawl through this driver's side window opening, but the intense heat and smoke made escape nearly impossible. Track workers and fellow drivers rushed to the scene with portable fire extinguishers, but the primitive equipment was inadequate for a gasoline fire of this magnitude. Ned Jarrett and several other drivers attempted to pull Roberts from the burning car, suffering burns to their hands and arms in the process. The track's fire truck required nearly 2 minutes to reach the accident scene due to its location on the far side of the speedway. Rescue crews finally extracted Roberts from the wreckage after battling the flames for over 3 minutes. He had sustained third-degree burns over 40% of his body, primarily on his face, hands, arms, and torso. Roberts remained conscious during the extraction and was transported immediately to Charlotte Memorial Hospital. Medical personnel began treating him for severe thermal injuries and smoke inhalation. Despite initial optimism from doctors, Roberts' condition deteriorated over the following weeks. The extensive burns became infected, and he developed pneumonia from smoke damage to his lungs. Roberts underwent multiple skin graft surgeries and spent weeks in the hospital's burn unit fighting for his life. His weight dropped from 185 pounds to less than 140 pounds during his hospitalization. On July 2, 1964, 39 days after the crash, Glenn Fireball Roberts died from complications related to his injuries. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia and infection secondary to thermal burns. Roberts' death shocked the NASCAR community and prompted the sanctioning body to implement its first major safety improvements, including better fire suppression systems and fuel cell regulations. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.